Hi everyone, my name is Alex Christensen, and I'm the lead Atlassian Suite engineer at AppDynamics. Today, I'm going to help you learn how to clean up your Atlassian Suite without losing your damn mind. About 3 years ago, my girlfriend and I bought our first house. It was a really exciting time for us. Sarah and I were so excited to, get out of apartment life and into a home. And I guess if he could have understood, our dog Max would have probably been stoked to know he was going to get his very own backyard very soon. When we were looking at homes, we decided that we were going to buy something that we could, fix up and really make our own. I think that Sarah probably understood the scope of that work a lot more than I did, but I knew we'd be getting into some projects, like painting the whole house, some new countertops, and remodeling our master bathroom. However, if you've ever bought a house before, you might know that you can find some interesting things around a fixer-upper. So the first thing I found out that our pool wasn't just dirty, it had exposed fiberglass, so hooray for another project we hadn't really anticipated. Another fun discovery was a full-on orange wall behind a shoddy wood paneling job. So there's some other more professional wood paneling in another room of the house, so we suspected that some previous owner tried to do a wood paneling project on their own and failed miserably, or the previous owners thought they could recreate the professional wood paneling job on their own, and they didn't succeed in that either. But either way, it was fun having a bright orange wall for a week or so. I think my favorite discovery, though, was the chicken wing bone that I found lodged in the track for the track door in the pantry to the kitchen. An easy fix, yes, but if that's not an indication of a house that needs a serious deep cleaning, I don't know what is. See, when you buy a house, you inherit the house as it was lived in by previous owners, for better or for worse. You have to take the time to assess the mess, make a plan, and then take action to clean up that mess. So now let's reframe this a little bit. Imagine this house is a Jira instance. As a Jira admin, it's not uncommon to get your hands on an existing instance and discover that a lot of projects and work needs to go into getting to an organized and productive working environment. I started at AppDynamics as an Atlassian Suite engineer about 2.5 years ago. It was my first time inheriting an Atlassian Suite from another team. In the past, I'd only set up new instances for teams who just wanted to start using the Atlassian tools. This instance I inherited had been in use for nearly 10 years, all the way from the time AppDynamics was just a small startup company to a company of nearly 2,000 people and now a part of Cisco. While this Atlassian Suite was technically usable, the combination of how much we grew over those past 10 years and having a Wild West perspective on global administration contributed to an untidy hodgepodge, and it needed some serious deep cleaning. It's extremely difficult to clean up something you inherited and didn't create. So today, I'm going to cover how we're cleaning up our Atlassian Suite at AppDynamics. So first, I'll cover how we assessed the mess, coined the term Jira hygiene internally, and created a plan of action for cleanup. And then next, I'll highlight the prep work we completed before really diving into our dedicated cleanup project. Then I'll expand on the details of said cleanup project. And then I'll wrap up with how we plan on maintaining our Jira hygiene after we take steps to clean. So, as with any mess, the first step we wanted to take was assessing said mess. We wanted to better understand the scope of what we needed to clean up and how to prioritize each step of that cleanup process. So, to give us the best context, let's take a look at the history of how we've used the Atlassian Suite at AppDynamics. The product teams within AppDynamics had been using Jira and Confluence Cloud since about 2008, which was known as on-demand back then. At that point, the company was still in its early days and in startup mode. Jira and Confluence Cloud could easily scale with their needs. Like many organizations at that time, AppDynamics did not have a dedicated Atlassian subject matter expert to help guide the architecture of how to configure the Atlassian Suite using best practices. For the most part, every user was a global admin, and for a company that was getting ready to grow its employee base exponentially, the configurations of our Atlassian Suite and the Wild West approach to Atlassian administration just wasn't very scalable. So with the idea that we needed to scale our Atlassian Suite in mind, in late 2016, the decision was made to move from Garrett to Bitbucket Data Center for our code source control repository management. On the coattails of this decision in early 2017 was also the decision to migrate our Jira and Confluence instances to Data Center, which we decided for a few reasons. So at the time, the user cap on Atlassian's cloud offerings was 2,000 users. Our organization was basically at this cap due to an uptick in employee onboarding, so we needed an instance where we could grow beyond this user cap. Also, being part of a larger organization and, in a highly regulated industry, we needed to be able to have control as to when new features are introduced to our end users. There's little to no control over new feature releases in any cloud product, and we really needed this control to help our end users have more consistency in the toolset they use day to day. And additionally, the Atlassian Marketplace had some options for server and data center instances that would fulfill specific requirements our user base wanted out of the Atlassian toolset, and we really wanted to be able to take advantage of our options in the marketplace. We completed our migration from Jira Cloud to Data Center in August of 2017. I won't dive into it too much, but we also began using Jira Service Desk internally for many of our support teams like IT, facilities, and more. If you do want to hear more about our journey with Jira Service Desk, my manager Jeff Tillett and I did a session on this at Summit 2018, and you can find a recording of that on the Atlassian Summit 2018 playlist on Atlassian's YouTube channel. As our organization was attempting to move into an agile model, we constantly found barriers in our Atlassian Suite's implementation, which prevented us from really being able to move into an agile model. Conversations often went, well, we could do that, but not with how Jira is set up today. This quickly got dubbed as bad Jira hygiene because we needed an easy way to refer to this situation. So between the time of our Jira data center migration and now, we've taken quite a few actions for cleanup, which I will cover here more in a bit. The latest significant project we completed was our migration of Confluence Cloud to Data Center as well, which we completed in June of 2019. We would have completed this project sooner, but there was more of a need for us to focus on Jira's hygiene than the migration of our Confluence instance to Data Center. In terms of cleaning up our Atlassian suite, it's been immensely beneficial having all of our suite in the Data Center offerings. Because Atlassian split the code base between cloud and server and data center offerings, it's difficult to have an Atlassian suite which is a hybrid deployment of cloud and self-managed offerings. Just by having all of our instances in Data Center has provided a more streamlined and uniform experience for our end users. And the same can be said for having all of your Atlassian suite all in the cloud as well. Now that I've given an overview and background of our use of the Atlassian suite, let's dive into some of the initial actions we took in order to achieve some big wins once we migrated our Jira from cloud to Data Center. At the point we were at when we migrated Jira from cloud to Data Center, the configurations in our Jira instance were pretty messy. To name a few things, workflows had way too many statuses, many of which were overlapping, and the transitions in these workflows just had too many unnecessary gates, conditions, and validators that prevented us from doing what we really needed to do in Jira. Many permission and notification configurations used user groups and individual users in their configuration. Now, there's technically nothing wrong with this type of configuration, and Jira allows you to do this, but these configurations really should be based on project roles, as this is a best practice to help scale these permission and notification schemes for shared use on different projects. User group and user management was also just an outright mess. There were many groups which overlapped in their purpose, multiple groups granting the same permissions or licenses to use any of our Atlassian applications, and on top of the configurations I just mentioned, this made troubleshooting problems more difficult than it needed to be. And as a team of Atlassian administrators, we rarely had a consistent answer for how to grant permissions to users. So individually, these things may not seem like a big deal. However, these types of misconfigurations can make Jira difficult to scale and sometimes impossible to troubleshoot if users are having problems using the tool. Additionally, the combination of these misconfigurations created a poor end-user experience for our user base. A lot of our users were unhappy with the Atlassian suite as our toolset of choice due to poor configurations. Many of them thought that the toolset could never do what we needed it to do. Our Atlassian administrative team knew that it was possible, but we also knew that we had a long road ahead of us. In addition to the cleanup itself, we had to regain and rebuild the trust in both our team and the toolset, which is much harder than the actual cleanup effort itself. To start off our cleanup project, we needed a few big wins to begin to rebuild that trust, and ideally, these big wins needed to bring a lot of value in a short period of time. So with that in mind, the first significant effort we chose to work on was cleaning up the workflow for our engineering teams building the AppDynamics product. So let's take a look at the original workflow we had in place before we started our cleanup. The existing workflow didn't quite follow Jira workflow best practices, so while technically it was usable, there were a lot of gates and barriers present. There were just too many overlapping statuses and more. My team and I knew we could present something a bit more user-friendly and simple than this workflow, so we set out to get our first big win as the new Atlassian administration team. First, we needed to complete a bit of discovery on our problem statement. We knew there were pain points and complaints from users using this workflow, but other than a lot of secondhand accounts and broad complaints, we didn't have any specific concrete data to validate our problem statement. We set out to work with engineering managers to understand the current pain points in this existing workflow, as well as better understand what end users actually wanted out of a workflow. More or less, we used 2 questions for the start of our discussion. What's the process you want to track, and what are your data points? Our discovery process took several weeks of interviews and data collection, but once we had that data ready, we were able to put together a proof of concept and work back and forth with our stakeholders to implement a cleaner version of this workflow. This back and forth took another several weeks, but we eventually ended up with this much cleaner workflow. As you can see, we significantly reduced the number of statuses in the workflow and granted users the flexibility and freedom to go from any status to the other at any point in the workflow. In addition to the value of just cleaning up misconfigured workflows in Jira, the purpose of focusing on this problem first was to show a few things. A process is usually simpler than you think it is. A workflow problem can be solved in other ways other than just adding a new status to a workflow. And trust users to do what they want to be able to do instead of implementing gates and barriers. The main goal here was to show that Jira doesn't have to be complicated to use, and I believe we achieved that with this project. It was a relatively quick win, and this really gave us a good foundation to start rebuilding trust in the Atlassian suite. After optimizing this workflow, we optimized issue types across the projects that the engineering teams use so they would be all working consistently, which would help us with reporting up the organization's work to executive leadership. Because of the size of our instance and migration from cloud to data center, there were actually some interesting technical problems to solve that we uncovered while working through this issue type cleanup, and we actually got to fix some infrastructure and database integrity issues through this process to improve Jira performance, clean up some errors our end users may have been facing but hadn't yet reported to us, and we made Jira easier to use overall. The next big project we took on was upgrading our Jira Data Center instance from 7.3 to 7.10 to take advantage of some performance improvements. Namely, we had the ability to archive projects to take their issues out of the search index, which improves the time it takes for Jira to reindex. And also, as data center customers, we also encountered a bug in our version of Jira that introduced cluster cache replication issues between each of our nodes in our data center cluster, which often meant that issue and user data was out of sync on these nodes, or we couldn't propagate data between or changes between the nodes correctly. This was a very important issue for us to resolve, as this would improve stability and reliability in Jira for our end users. As we worked through these 3 big projects, we were simultaneously also trying to transform our Atlassian suite into a toolset that supported an agile transformation within our company. I was lucky enough to participate in this initiative as the toolset owner and subject matter expert of the Atlassian suite for our agile transformation initiative at AppD. As the subject matter expert, I was often getting the question of, can Jira do X? So 9 times out of 10, my answer was along the lines of, well, Jira could do that, but not with how Jira is set up today. There were too many poor configurations still in our instance, preventing us from implementing new features intended to help our executive leadership learn and report on the projects our engineering teams were working on to build our product. Examples of this included our project structure. There wasn't a consistent or viable structure of our engineering projects in Jira, resulting in inconsistency in where projects are tracked, where to open new issues, and where engineers were tracking their work. We also had poor user group management and organization. If we wanted to be able to solve problems like what's assigned to a particular group of users, we weren't really able to do so with reliable results. There were also just too many user groups, many of which overlapped in purpose or were duplicates used for a variety of different reasons. We also had a lot of distracting and unused things. There were too many custom fields that users never used, didn't know what they were for, or had duplicates. We also had some issue types that weren't being used or overlapped in their naming. As Jira admins, we also had hundreds of inactive workflows, screens, field configurations, and other schemes that were cluttering up our instance, which made troubleshooting and creating new configurations more time-consuming than it really needed to be. So my answer of, well, we could technically do that in Jira, but can't with how Jira works today, is the reason we coined the term Atlassian hygiene. Mostly because everyone was sick of my same answer anytime, they asked me a question about Jira, and they just wanted to hear something else come out of my mouth. I too was getting tired of referring to the same problem over and over again, so I took it upon myself to create a plan for a project dedicated to this Atlassian hygiene problem. Spoilers, they accepted my proposal, so that brings me up to my next topic, the nitty-gritty of a dedicated cleanup project. After hearing the pain points and problems we kept trying to tackle with our current state of Atlassian hygiene, I came up with a list of initiatives I thought were important to tackle and the order I wanted to tackle them in. These are the initiatives I proposed and why I thought each initiative was important, and I definitely recommend that you consider taking on the same or similar efforts in your own Atlassian suite implementations. So firstly, we wanted to remove inactive or unused schemes and configurations. For the global Jira admins, these extraneous configurations continued just to get in our way of providing the best support and scale that we could. The first step here was it's rather low-hanging fruit since we were just cleaning up unused cobwebs anyway, but would be extremely helpful for us to, for getting a better baseline of where we actually stood with our Atlassian hygiene. We then wanted to move on to reviewing and optimizing our user groups. We had over 200 groups in our user database alone, most of which were empty, unused in any configurations, or duplicates. This problem caused issues with user onboarding, permission management, and more. We also use our Jira user database as the database for the rest of our Atlassian suite, which includes Bitbucket and Confluence. So we needed to ensure that our user database was usable and consistent across all three services. The next step we wanted to take was optimizing our Jira project structure. While working through the previous initiatives I mentioned, our product organization was also going through a reorg. This reorg ended up being more or less very similar to the tribes and squads model, which we dubbed internally as crews and squads for our own purposes. Our current structure of Jira projects didn't match this model at all. We had around 50 projects for our product organization alone, but there was no consistent matchup to a specific crew, squad, or component of the AppDynamics product. We felt it was important to refactor our Jira project structure to reflect our new organizational model. One of the easiest ways to ensure good Atlassian hygiene is to make sure your instance is up to date on the most recent, stable, and supported version. When we saw that the Jira 8.5 Enterprise release was announced last October, we immediately placed the upgrade on our roadmap. We're currently on 7.10.2, and the performance improvements that come along with the major version upgrade is valuable enough to prove its importance in our quest to achieve healthy Atlassian hygiene. We then wanted to look at optimizing custom fields in Jira. My fellow Jira admins out there will know that too many custom fields can cause performance issues in a Jira instance, since this can greatly increase the size of the index. Reducing the number of custom fields can help Jira perform and re-index more quickly. Additionally, regardless of performance concerns, we have too many custom fields in the first place. The old Wild West style of Jira administration allowed pretty much anyone to create custom fields. So that resulted in duplicate fields with different names, duplicate named fields but used for different purposes, and fields that don't really need to exist to capture what you need in the first place. Cleaning up custom fields would not only help speed up Jira, but would help our end users work in Jira more effectively as well. So we also use EasyBI at AppD. It's been a great reporting tool for our product organization, but over the years, reports have become outdated, our project structure has changed, and the requirements for reporting have changed. We wanted to take an opportunity to optimize these reports and refactor our organization of EasyBI accounts to reflect our new Jira project structure. We also have too many link type options available when linking issues together. For more consistent reporting options, we wanted to take the time to optimize our issue link types. Another smaller initiative we wanted to tackle was cleaning up issue types. Like with custom fields and link types, we had quite a few redundancies in the purposes and naming of some of our issue types, so a quick review, cleanup, and consolidation would likely help our end users better understand the issue type they need to choose when creating new issues in any project. To help our global and project administrators, we also wanted to optimize project roles. Again, there were duplicates in both purpose and naming that we wanted to clear up to avoid confusion on which roles to use, or at least better document the purpose of each role to help our project admins make better educated decisions on how to use them in their own projects. And lastly, we wanted to begin to clean up Agile boards. It's true that anyone can create a board in Jira, and that's great, totally fine. That's one of the great things about Jira. But we had boards in our instance that were, several years old, as well as owned or managed by users who are just no longer with the company. Plus, the more boards we have, the harder it is probably for someone to go find a board they're looking for just using a blank search. So reducing the number of boards we have would be helpful in reducing the scope of returned search results. As of now, we've completed the first 3 initiatives on this list, which I would argue were some of the bigger initiatives we wanted to take on, at least in terms of scope. Since we've completed those 3 initiatives, I'd like to share with you the methodology behind each initiative to demonstrate to you how we completed them. So our first big dedicated hygiene project was to get rid of all the cobwebs in our Jira instance. We had tons of inactive and unused configurations just sitting idle, taking up precious space in our database. To begin this project, we first had to determine which configurations we wanted to clean up. After some discussion amongst our Atlassian admin team, we came up with this list. Once we had this list, we needed to determine the criteria for what constitutes a configuration to be unused or inactive. So there should be a discovery task for each configuration type. This configuration will probably be different for every Jira instance, so without going into the nitty-gritty of each configuration, here are a couple things that might be helpful to keep in mind when determining this criteria. For custom fields, there's a marketplace app called Custom Field Manager from No Pointer Exception Systems, which compiles a lot of information for you about custom fields in your Jira instance. We used this app to determine if a custom field was used on any screens, had any values in the database, and if it was used in any configurations or schemes. It's a relatively inexpensive app, especially considering the value of the information it provides, so I'd recommend checking it out for your cleanup purposes. When cleaning up configurations, it's good to start with a larger scope and work your way down. So let's take screens for example. The highest level of scope in screen-related configuration are issue-type screen schemes, because screen schemes are used in issue-type screen schemes, and then schemes are used in screen schemes. In our case, an issue-type screen scheme, the top level, is considered unused if no projects use the scheme in their project configuration. A screen scheme, going down one level, is considered unused if it's not used in any issue-type screen schemes, and a screen, going down even one more level, that's considered unused if it's not used in any screen schemes and workflow transitions. So if we delete from the top down, we can get a much more accurate picture of what configurations are actually used or unused, and then we can delete more appropriately. Once you determine the criteria for inactive and unused configurations, you can delete with your heart's content. It's really up to you if you want to keep any sort of backups of this data before deleting. You could take a snapshot or backup of the database if you have the resources to do so. You could take screenshots of configurations and save those screenshots to some shared drive. With workflows, something that we do is we export the workflows to XML and then we keep them in a Bitbucket repository for our Atlassian suite management. It's really up to you how you want to handle that. So once you're finished deleting these cobwebs, treat yourself to a beer or whatever your vice of choice is for celebration. You deserve it, and it'll probably prepare you for the work that's yet to come, which in our case was user group cleanup. As I mentioned before, we had over 200 groups in our user database alone, most of which were empty, unused in any configurations, or duplicates. In our previous initiative, we already removed unused groups with no users in them, but even after that, we still had just over 150 user groups to deal with. Our job here was a lot more involved than that cobweb cleanup. We needed to pretty much analyze each user group and how it's used today in our entire Atlassian suite before we could consider what to do with it, whether that be continuing to use that group, consolidate it with another group, or delete it altogether. Before the analysis of each group, however, we needed to do a few things first. We needed to determine the guidelines for what constituted a valid user group once we finished the cleanup, because these criteria would also guide the decisions we make during the cleanup process. Your criteria will probably be different, but this is the criteria we ultimately decided on, and what I recommend at least as a starting place for your own Atlassian Suite implementations. A group is a valid user group if it's based on organizational hierarchy. It's occasionally useful to execute searches based on people in certain organizations and teams. A group is valid if a group is used or needed for a filter subscription. Filter subscriptions in Jira actually only work with user groups. If the user group's intended use is to easily grant a larger group of users the same permissions across multiple applications, projects, repos, spaces, what have you, then the user group should be valid. It's much easier and faster to add a user to one user group instead of a bunch of different projects, repos, spaces, etc. The only downside to this is that end users cannot add or remove users from user groups without an Atlassian administrator's assistance. If the user group grants a global level permission, the user group is valid. So for example, the group Jira administrators might grant the global Jira administrator permission in Jira and is therefore a valid group. And lastly, if the user group grants a license to some Atlassian application, then the user group is valid. Once we had this criteria, we also wanted to go ahead and choose the user groups that we knew would grant global permissions, application access to our Atlassian applications, and what groups would populate project roles and new projects by default. In the current state, there were too many groups granting global permissions and application access, so we wanted to consolidate to a single user group as much as possible for easier user onboarding and permission troubleshooting. Again, this would help guide us in our decisions in which groups to deprecate or keep around. Next, we needed an easy way to gather a summary of how the user group is used throughout the entire Atlassian suite. Groups can be used in a ton of different places. They can be used in project roles in Jira, global permissions in any Atlassian application, filters and dashboard sharing, Bitbucket project and Confluence-based permissions, permission and notification schemes. There's so many places to think about. So I don't think you have to imagine how tedious of a job it would be to look up each of these places manually and then document all of it manually. So I set out to create a script to do the hard work for me. With the help of some of Atlassian's documentation, I was able to script some database queries to search for group usage, as well as use the Bob Swift CLI add-on to search for group usage to prevent direct database queries as much as possible. I want to go ahead and stress that querying on the Jira database is not something that should be taken lightly, and I don't necessarily recommend it. If you do decide to go down this path, and like we did, please be sure to test on a development instance and use read-only user accounts to execute your queries to ensure the integrity of the database. Once this script gathered everything I needed it to, I also used the Bob Swift CLI as part of the script to create a Jira issue in our team's project that included all this information I needed for analysis to ensure that we looked at each user group. My team and I went through a total of 157 of these issues to either deprecate or document the purpose of each user group. In the end, we were pretty ruthless, and we ended the initiative with only 30 groups left in total. And because of the time we took up front to complete this analysis, our end users actually experienced very little interference or interruptions as a result of our work. This is also probably the hygiene project that I most personally am proud of so far. I learned a lot about how and where user groups can be used in the Atlassian suite, and I learned a lot about scripting these sort of administrative tasks. In addition to being very valuable for admins and end users alike, this was a very rewarding project for me in terms of the value I brought and what I learned from the entire process. Anyway, it's enough bragging on my part, so let's move on to the most recent project we completed for Atlassian Hygiene, which was optimizing Jira project structure. This actually was an initiative I wanted to work on from the moment I started working at AppDynamics. Our project structure was not something I would consider sound, in my opinion. The definition of what a project represented in Jira for our organization was relatively inconsistent. Some projects represented a component of our product, some projects represented a single team's workspace, and some projects were, cross-functional. Because of the current structure, we were subject to inconsistencies in planning and tracking altitude across all the teams involved in developing our product, which resulted in a poor ability to scale our platform and teams. As I mentioned briefly earlier, we also recently went through a reorg and now have a model closely representing the tribes and squads model you might be familiar with, but we call it crews and squads. This reorg gave us a model to follow for our new project structure. So upon completion of that reorg, we met with the leadership of all the crews to evaluate the difference between how we're currently organized into Jira projects today versus how the crews and squads are actually aligned. Based on these discussions, we were able to deliver one of two solutions to every crew in our product organization. A single project will either represent an entire crew, and all squads within that crew will work out of the single project, or a project will represent a squad, which will be put into a project category with the name of the parent crew. Now, at a surface level, this may sound like the reorganization for the sake of reorganization. However, we actually saw quite a few important benefits as a result. We now had a consistent model for rolling up reporting on progress on all epics and stories in real time by squad, crew, and/or product initiative. We could then provide this consistent reporting to executive leadership, while at the same time giving crews and squads more power to work the way that they want to work, whether that be through different workflows, fields, or what have you. Jira's inconsistency problems were also mitigated, resulting in a better awareness of how projects are used, a better understanding of where work items should live, and many years of cobwebs were cleaned up. Our end goal is to align this crews and squads model across our entire build and release toolset, so like having Bitbucket projects and Confluence spaces follow the same model. This new Jira project structure was a logical place for us to start, and I believe the work that we did here to reorganize these Jira projects has really set us up for success to complete those future projects. So to recap where we're at so far, we've completed several of the initiatives for our dedicated Atlassian hygiene project. We cleaned up a lot of cobwebs by removing unused and inactive configurations from Jira, resulting in quicker turnaround time for admin work, as well as some performance improvements. We analyzed and optimized our Atlassian user group management to allow us to better utilize user groups in project roles, application access, and permission or notification management. And then we updated and refined our Jira project structure to reflect our new crews and squads model within our product organization for consistency and rolling up reporting and more consistent project ownership. As of now, we're currently working on our upgrade to Jira 8.5. This is going to be a very valuable upgrade for our end users and admins alike, if not for the performance improvements alone. At this point, I do want to stress that cleaning up an instance like this, with the initiatives that we want to tackle, it's a time-consuming process, especially in larger organizations where change may not be able to happen or may not be able to be implemented as quickly as a smaller startup organization. However, the value I think we've gotten out of our time spent refining the Atlassian suite has just been incredible. I used to say the word Jira and would get a shudder or eye roll because the tool just wasn't very easy to use, and it probably hindered a lot of productivity among engineers and leadership alike. But as we've been able to prove the value of our Atlassian suite, we've received a lot more positive response from our end users, in addition to the improvements we've seen in the toolset itself. Alright, so we've completed all this wonderful cleanup work. Our job is finished, right? I would have hoped that was the case, but let's be realistic here. You're always going to need to brush your teeth, you're always going to need to shower or bathe at some point, and you're always going to need a haircut. Cleanup is important, but hygiene is more than just about a cleanup project. You have to maintain what you've already cleaned up. If you don't maintain the hygiene, then you very well might end up right back where you started, if not worse. So to maintain the work we've implemented so far, we've done a few things. As we work on cleanup initiatives, we've been defining guidelines for our own team to follow when introducing new changes and new configurations into the Atlassian suite, similar to how engineers and coders might create coding standards for their team or organization to follow. That way, we can easily refer to what we did, as well as easily onboard new team members to help them get accustomed to our implementation of the Atlassian suite. To help us maintain and audit user groups and Jira projects, we've used ScriptRunner to create scripted listeners whenever the events trigger for user group creation and new Jira project creation. And then we have this script send a notification to a Slack channel that we monitor. So this helps us monitor for new groups or projects that we may not actually want or need, or at least triggers a discussion amongst our admin team to make sure that we're aware of and documenting the purpose of these new groups or new projects. To help us maintain our unused and inactive configurations, my team and I meet about once a month for a 1-hour audit call to review the configurations in our instance. Because we already did the cleanup once and know the criteria which constitutes an unused or inactive configuration, we can have this meeting relatively quickly and easily remove anything that shouldn't be kept around anymore. Also, we haven't started on this yet, but we'd really like to look into how we can automate the removal of these unused or inactive configurations using scheduled script jobs. We have the criteria in place already to know whether or not a configuration is unused or inactive, so it's just a matter of figuring out how to script that. We'll probably start with seeing how much we can achieve using the Bob Swift CLI, in addition to creating some custom REST endpoints using ScriptRunner to take advantage of the flexibility of Jira's REST API and Groovy scripting. I hope the points I've covered today provide some insight not only to how AppDynamics has set forth to clean up our Atlassian suite and maintain good Atlassian hygiene, but into how you can take what I covered today and apply it to your own Atlassian implementations. So like with a fixer-upper house, I think it's important to keep the following things in mind when working on these cleanup projects. What are the biggest pain points? Maybe looking at this from a new homeowner's perspective, what absolutely has to be fixed before we move all of our stuff into the house? Talk to your end users and fellow admins to determine what these pain points are and make a point to focus on those. Which projects bring the most value in a short amount of time? And hygiene maintenance is key and makes cleanup a lot easier to manage. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you're able to take away something from this you can implement in your organization right away.